My name is Meredith Callahan. I'm 62, and I've spent most of my life trying to keep peace where it was never fully welcome. Organized, patient, and careful, I've learned to navigate the undercurrents of family dynamics without rocking the boat. But as I stepped into the bright dining room of my daughter Claire's husband's parents' home in suburban Columbus, Ohio, I felt a tension I couldn't ignore. The table was set perfectly crisp, white linens, polished silverware, and steaming plates of golden brown steaks. I smiled politely at the chatter around me, but my gaze immediately fell on the empty space where my plate should have been. Vivian, my daughter's mother-in-law, offered a saccharine smile while handing out imported French desserts to everyone else. I counted 7 plates, 7 tarts, all except mine. Claire, standing beside her husband, gave a small shrug. "I only ordered for family," she said, her tone light, almost rehearsed. My chest tightened. "Daniel." My husband leaned slightly toward me and murmured under his breath, "Don't do this, not here." I forced my shoulders back, ignoring the heat rising to my face. Around the table, I caught subtle glances, some curious, some judgmental. The words and gestures of past holidays, birthdays, and gatherings played in my mind, the overlooked contributions, the re-gifted presents, the whispered dismissals. I sat down at the end of the table, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the familiar sting of exclusion. But this time, I promised myself it wouldn't be silent. Something had shifted, a quiet determination settling in my chest. Today was different. Today I would measure the weight of all those years and decide whether it was time to speak. I kept my posture straight and my expression neutral, but every movement at the table drew my attention. Plates clinked, wine glasses swirled, and polite laughter filled the room, yet every interaction seemed calculated to remind me of my place. Vivian leaned in toward Lindsay with a conspiratorial smile, whispering something I couldn't hear, and the younger woman's eyes sparkled with approval. I counted the subtle nods, the exchanged glances, and felt the sting of being consistently excluded. Claire passed by with a tray of sides, offering a small, perfunctory smile, and I realized how easily she had adopted her in-laws' hierarchy. Daniel kept his eyes on his plate silently, trying to smooth over the tension, but not daring to challenge his mother. I thought back to previous gatherings the Christmas when I had received a small re-gifted candle, while everyone else got personalized gifts, the times my ideas were ignored or dismissed with a laugh. The pattern was undeniable, and the weight of those memories pressed against my ribs. Aunt Sharon, seated a few places down, caught my eye and offered a gentle, knowing glance. Her presence was a quiet lifeline, a subtle acknowledgement that not everyone in this room shared the Thompsons' rigid sense of propriety. That small gesture bolstered me more than words ever could. As the courses continued to arrive for everyone but me, I reminded myself that observation was a tool. Watching, listening, and cataloging would give me clarity and strength when the time came to respond. I could no longer rely on patience or invisibility. I had to measure each glance, each whisper, each deliberate exclusion, and consider how I would reclaim my space in a room that had never truly welcomed me. The conversation around the table continued polite and rehearsed, but my mind had already begun planning the next move. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, lowering his gaze to his plate as though if he focused hard enough, the tension in the room might dissolve on its own. "Don't do this, not here," he murmured. Barely audible, a soft attempt to quiet me rather than confront his mother or sister. I felt the familiar frustration welling up inside me, a mix of disappointment and disbelief. For years, he had chosen the path of least resistance, and now in this moment, I saw the same hesitation I had witnessed countless times before. My mind drifted to earlier gatherings, holidays, and birthdays, when my contributions were minimized or ignored. The painstakingly prepared dishes that Vivian complimented in passing for Lindsay, the subtle scolding when I suggested a change in seating arrangements, the quiet dismissal when I offered my opinion on family decisions. I had tried to overlook these slights, telling myself they were harmless, that patience and kindness would win the day. But this lunch was another reminder. My patience had been mistaken for compliance, my kindness for weakness. I forced myself to take a steadying breath and remind myself of who I was. Meredith Callahan, 62, a woman who had spent decades managing a household finances and relationships with careful thought and responsibility. I was tired of shrinking, tired of watching my voice disappear in a room that claimed to celebrate family but actively excluded me. As the conversation flowed around the table, polite questions, small jokes, and half-hearted chatter, I felt the shift within me. I would not allow Daniel's hesitation, nor the silent approval of Vivian, or the indulgent smirks of Lindsay to dictate my place any longer. This time, I would speak. I would reclaim the space that had been denied to me for so long. The moment for silence had passed, and with my mind focused and my resolve firm, I prepared to turn observation into action as the lunch continued. As I sat at the edge of the table, the hum of polite conversation around me seemed to fade, replaced by the memories I had tucked away over the years. I remembered last Christmas when Vivian had sniffed at the homemade stuffing I had prepared, comparing it to the store-bought version she insisted was more sophisticated. Lindsay had smirked as she passed the plate along her eyes, shining with smug approval, and I had smiled politely, hiding the flush rising in my cheeks. Birthday dinners were no different. I recalled one early spring evening when I had spent hours arranging a small family celebration for Claire, only to have Vivian comment on the modest decorations and the simplistic menu all in front of the extended family. Lindsay's laughter had followed, subtle but pointed, as if to emphasize my inadequacy. I had tried to shrug it off, telling myself that it was their way of joking, but the sting lingered long after the table had cleared. Financial matters had been another battleground. Vivian had once taken it upon herself to review my household accounts when I had helped plan a family vacation, shaking her head at my careful budgeting. "You really should have more savings," she had said, her voice light but condescending, glancing at Daniel as though to reinforce the judgment. Lindsay had added, "I could never handle all that work," with a smirk, oblivious to the years of responsibility I had shouldered with quiet diligence. Yet these repeated slights had taught me something vital. Observation and preparation were my allies. I had learned to catalog every nuance, the way Vivian's lips tightened at certain comments, the exact timing of Lindsay's smirks, the subtle shifts in Daniel's posture when tension rose. Each moment of judgment, each whispered aside, had strengthened my understanding of the family's dynamics and honed my own strategic thinking. Sitting now at this lunch, I realized that the years of exclusion and observation had not weakened me, they had readied me. Every insult and slight had built a foundation of patience and resolve. And as I felt the familiar heat of being overlooked, I knew that the time had come to translate all of that preparation into action, moving deliberately toward the confrontation I had long avoided. I looked across the table at Daniel, my hands resting lightly on my lap, and felt a firmness settle into my chest. The chatter around the room continued, polite and practiced, but my attention was fixed. "Daniel," I said, my voice quiet but deliberate, "am I family or not?" The question cut through the hum of conversation like a knife. Forks paused mid-air. Laughter faltered, and the clinking of glasses seemed impossibly loud. Vivian froze, her smile tightening into something brittle, and Lindsay's eyes darted toward her mother as if seeking guidance. Claire, who had been fidgeting with her napkin, quickly looked away, her gaze fixed firmly on the tabletop. Not a word passed for a moment, but the weight of the silence was unmistakable. Aunt Sharon, seated a few places down, tilted her head toward me, her expression calm but sharp. There was a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes, a quiet recognition that this question carried truth, long ignored. It was as though she alone understood that the moment I had waited for was finally here, and she bore witness to it without judgment or interference. Daniel's hand trembled slightly as he set his fork down. Don't do this, not here," he muttered, his voice betraying a tension he had tried so hard to suppress. But I could see it, his discomfort, the hesitation, the understanding that the question was necessary, overdue and unavoidable. I straightened in my chair and met his gaze evenly. I asked, because this has been left unspoken for far too long. I've carried years of being on the outside, of having my contributions minimized and my presence treated as optional. I am here fully present, fully invested, yet invisible. I am family in every sense, except the one that matters most to this table. The room held its breath. Every whispered aside, every side glance, every subtle judgment from the past months and years had led to this moment. And now the first cracks in the facade were showing, delicate but undeniable. I drew a steady breath, preparing myself to speak what had been held inside for far too long, knowing that nothing about the rest of the lunch would remain the same. I let the silence stretch a moment longer, letting the weight of the question settle over the table. Then I began, my voice steady, deliberate, carrying the years I had endured. For decades, I said, I have managed households' coordinated schedules, paid bills and planned celebrations for this family. I have contributed my time, my energy, and my patience, and it has been largely invisible to those who claim to love me. Vivian's lips tightened, and Lindsay's hand paused mid-bite, as though my words had knocked the air from the room. I continued, unflinching, naming the moments that had mattered most to me, yet were dismissed. The meticulously planned holiday dinners, the evenings I spent balancing budgets, the times I ensured every gift and gesture was thoughtful, even when my own efforts went unnoticed. Each memory was precise, deliberate evidence of my diligence and presence. "And Daniel," I said, turning slightly toward my husband, "you have remained silent more often than not, acquiescing to judgments and allowing favoritism toward Lindsay to shape the narrative of this household. I am not asking for validation now. I am stating a truth that has been ignored for too long." The Thompsons' eyes widened, and I caught the subtle shift in their postures. Vivian's gaze flickered between my face and Daniel's, searching for a weakness or an apology that didn't come. Lindsay's smirk faltered, a momentary crack in her carefully maintained superiority. Across the table, Aunt Sharon's expression softened her eyes, offering quiet acknowledgement, a silent nod that the truth I spoke was both deserved and overdue. I pressed on calmly, recounting small indignities that had built over years, the dismissive remarks about my cooking, the side glances at my financial prudence, the assumption that I was somehow less capable or less invested than others, simply because I was not part of their bloodline. I could see the discomfort settling into the room, tangible and electric, as the family realized for the first time that the life they assumed to dominate and judge had been fully lived and fully managed by me. I leaned back, letting my words linger. There was no malice in my tone, only clarity, only fact. The space around me had changed. The air felt heavier, yet more honest, and I knew that nothing about the lunch or their perception of me would ever be the same. I reached into my bag and withdrew a thin manila folder, placing it squarely in front of me on the polished oak table. The subtle thwack of its landing seemed impossibly loud, cutting through the hum of polite chatter. The room froze. Vivian's smile faltered. Lindsay's fork hovered midair, and even Claire's cheeks flushed with surprise. Daniel's eyes widened, slightly caught between disbelief and dread. This, I said, voice calm but unwavering, contains everything necessary to clarify what has been overlooked for far too long. I slid the folder toward Daniel, my gaze steady, making no apology for the moment I had orchestrated. I had spent weeks assembling the documents tracing financial contributions and recording household management that had quietly fallen to me over the years. Every receipt, every account, every detail of the unpaid labor that had sustained this family, all laid bare. Vivian leaned forward, her composure cracking. Meredith. "What is this?" she asked, though the question carried more accusation than curiosity. "I've prepared these," I said, "not to humiliate, not to shame, but to ensure that what I have contributed and endured is acknowledged. The assumptions, the exclusions, the constant diminishment, these are now matters of record." A hush settled over the table. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her napkin, flustered by the sudden shift in authority. Lindsay blinked rapidly, her confident smirk gone, replaced with the realization that her teasing and her mother's judgment had consequences. Daniel's shoulders slumped. His usual hesitation had met a boundary he could not ignore. Aunt Sharon's eyes met mine across the table, and in them, I saw quiet approval. She had understood all along the patience I had exercised, the intelligence and preparation that had led to this precise moment. It was not reckless. It was inevitable. I leaned back slightly, letting the weight of the folder speak for me. Years of being underestimated, ignored, and dismissed were no longer invisible. Every glance, every whispered comment, every subtle slight that had been tolerated now had its reckoning. The Thompsons sat in stunned silence, realizing for the first time that the balance of control had shifted. The lunch continued, but nothing about it or them would ever feel the same, and I knew the next move would test how far their acknowledgement of truth would reach. The silence after I placed the folder on the table stretched longer than any pause I had experienced before. Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line, and Tom's hand trembled slightly as he set down his fork. Claire's face had gone pale, her composure unraveling, and Lindsay stared at me as if she were seeing someone she thought she knew for the first time. The hum of polite chatter had vanished, replaced by the low murmur of whispered debates, half questions, and sharp exhalations. Aunt Sharon leaned slightly toward me, her eyes offering quiet reassurance. Her subtle nod told me that this was exactly the right moment, that my words and preparation carried the weight of truth that could no longer be ignored. I felt a measure of relief in that recognition, a validation that someone outside the direct line of judgment understood the necessity of this action. Vivian cleared her throat, attempting to reclaim authority. "Meredith, this is unnecessary," she said, her tone sharp but brittle. Tom added, "We never intended to make you feel excluded." Their words sounded hollow, rehearsed, like a poorly memorized apology meant to calm witnesses rather than acknowledge reality. Claire's hands shook slightly as she clutched her napkin, the familiar hierarchy they had relied upon crumbling before her eyes. The whispered debates continued around the table, some family members murmuring support, others offering hesitant glances in Vivian and Tom's direction. Their discomfort was palpable. Even Lindsay seemed unsure of how to respond, her smirk replaced by a tense, searching gaze. It was clear that the carefully maintained image of control the Thompsons had relied on for years had fractured, and the consequences were immediate. I allowed the moment to breathe, letting the weight of years of exclusion and judgment settle on them fully. No one spoke for several seconds, and in that pause, the dynamic had already shifted. The balance of power once assumed by default had been reclaimed, and the room felt irrevocably different. As the first murmurs of acknowledgement began to surface, I knew that the next step would solidify this shift and determine whether respect and accountability would take root. After the lunch, I left the Thompson household with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. The folder remained a symbol of clarity and assertion, a tangible record of everything I had carried silently for decades. At home, I focused on myself, on reclaiming the space and energy that had long been siphoned by others' expectations. Each day, I organized my finances, reviewed the household accounts I had maintained, and set plans in motion that reinforced my autonomy. Daniel tried to reach me in small, hesitant ways, offering soft apologies or reminders of shared history. But I maintained firm boundaries. The decisions I had made at the table were not about punishment. They were about clarity, about establishing the respect I had long been denied. He struggled privately, caught between loyalty to his family and the truth I had presented. I allowed him the space to reconcile with his own choices while refusing to compromise the position I had carved for myself. Among the extended family, murmurs of reconsideration began to ripple. Some relatives who had long tolerated Vivian's subtle cruelties offered quiet acknowledgement of what they had witnessed. Even Lindsay, while still prideful, began to measure her words, realizing that the unquestioned hierarchy she had relied on was no longer secure. The subtle shifts were small, almost imperceptible, but they confirmed that the action I had taken had created space for reflection and change. I dedicated myself to the rhythms of my own life, embracing the sense of fulfillment that comes from competence, self-respect, and the knowledge that I had acted with integrity. Each moment of independence reinforced the understanding that my choices were mine alone, and that dignity could be preserved even when long-held assumptions and familial patterns had been challenged. With the foundation of clarity and control in place, I prepared to reflect fully on the meaning of family, the lessons of resilience, and the life I intended to lead without compromise. Sitting in the quiet of my own home, I let the events of the past hours settle into memory. The weight of exclusion, judgment, and unspoken expectations that had shadowed decades of my life felt lighter, now replaced by a calm sense of resolution. I thought of the folder, the meticulous records, and the quiet decisiveness that had shifted the balance at the table. It wasn't vengeance that guided me. It was clarity, self-respect, and the recognition that my voice and presence mattered. I reflected on what dignity truly meant: the courage to speak truth without malice, the ability to assert boundaries even when those closest to you hesitate, and the understanding that self-respect cannot be granted by others, it must be claimed. For years I had tolerated subtle cruelties, smoothing over discomfort to maintain peace, and yet in doing so, I had diminished myself. Today, that ended. The silence that followed the confrontation, once tense and oppressive, now felt restorative. There was no need for applause, reconciliation, or acknowledgement from the Thompsons. My sense of fulfillment came from knowing I had acted with integrity and that I had finally taken control of the narrative of my own life. The calm that spread through me was steady, unshakable, and freeing. I looked around my living room, noting the small comforts I had often overlooked while attending to the expectations of others. Each object, each corner of this space felt more vivid, more personal, more mine. I realized that family, whether defined by blood love or respect, was something I could choose in how I nurtured my own life and relationships. With that clarity, I let myself exhale fully, trusting that the silence would continue to heal rather than wound, and that the future could be guided by choice courage and the knowledge that I was no longer bound by the approval of anyone but myself.